All right. It's a great privilege for me to introduce Abhinav Pandya. He's a very renowned uh, security policy maker in the country, not just a policy maker, an author, and a speaker at various international forums. He's he has a degree from St. Stephen's College in Delhi, and he has a graduation from Cornell University in public affairs, one of the best in the world. And I'm sure you've all gone through the list of newspapers and media houses he writes, and he's on the TV channels, and he's got a wide, very deep knowledge on, he's done a lot of research on security. So on that note, he was also the Government of India consultant. He organizes various forums. He's on one of the top committees on securities. So the list is big to introduce Abhinav. So without wasting further without taking more time, I would pass this to Abhinav.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Anant. And it's a very generous introduction for me. Okay, I'm still, I still consider myself as a very young scholar trying to learn things in the domain of security. But it's indeed a pleasure and a great honor to be here with all of you today. I chose my topic. Initially, I was trying to focus on the national level threats, but then Anand suggested that we have to expand a bit. So I just preferred to make it a little wider and just make it about the global security challenges. Frankly speaking, friends, in India, I would say not long back, but at least 15 years back, when it came to the issues of strategic affairs or national security, at the max, we thought of Jammu and Kashmir and what Pakistan was trying to do in Jammu and Kashmir. Nothing much came to our minds, because we as Indians, especially in the North Indian sleepy two-tier towns, we were living in a very comfortable sleepy zone, we didn't feel much threat. But then 9/11 happened. And after that, the American intervention in Afghanistan happened. Even in the case of India, the terrorism threat expanded, and it took many, devious incarnations in India. There were bomb blasts in various parts of the country. And then that generated a very, something called strategic consciousness, which was, I wouldn't say absent in the Indian history, but certainly in the Indian subconscious mind or the Indian psyche, collective psyche over a long period. It wasn't very dominant because, of the comfortable lifestyle which we were used to, and we were living in that, shell-like existence. But then, yes, over the last 15 to 20 years, world has again come face to face with the security threats which are national and international. And today, especially in 2021, we live in a world which is very unpredictable, very uncertain, and these security threats, they impact not just the governments, not just the big corporate institutions, but each and every single human person. And just best example to quote in this regard is this whole corona phenomenon. So corona, the rise of and the origins of this virus, very suspicious. Still they are being investigated. And strong evidence. Even I would say there is a very strong case for considering it as some kind of a bio warfare. And no one can deny it. It's being discussed not just here on this forum, but at various places among the global, in the portals of the global mighty intelligence agencies, in the power circles of India, West, and various other countries. And this threat impacted not just the government, but it made life hell for each and every single person. It destroyed economies. It destroyed social, cultural fabric of the societies. So this is just one example of the threats, which we are going to witness in the future and how they will impact our lives. So given this background, now I'll start my presentation. I don't really like to use PowerPoint presentation much, but still, I mean, I was told that, I mean, it's something which the audience will appreciate. That's why I've brought something. But more or less, I'm going to speak on what I have prepared in my mind. So I, over the last 15, 20 years, I studied the trend, and then, I mean, given the study of that trend, we can always forecast about what's going to happen in the next 15 to 20 years. I would say 10, 15 years. This whole domain of security studies and the challenges is completely going to alter. And we will face 3 to 4 broad categories of security threats. First, let me begin with the threat of terrorism and non-state actors. Okay, just a moment. The threat of terrorism and non-state actors. If you look at the history, terrorism has always been the tactic used by rebellious groups, insurgent groups, guerrilla groups, or even the state actors. Over the last 100 years of, 100, 200 years, various governments have used, and it's been there. But it has changed its forms, various times. It has progressed, it has evolved. And especially over the last 3 decades, the threat of terrorism, and I'm broadly going to focus on the Islamist terrorism in this lecture, because, I mean, nothing specific. There can be various categories of terrorism. You can have ultra-left terrorist organizations, like you have the Nakshal groups in the eastern states of India. You can have ideological terrorist groups, fighting for the independence of the country. But majorly, as a security challenge, which we are facing right now, is the terrorism that emanates from religious extremism. And here I'm going to focus more on the Islamic extremist groups. This all happened, I mean, this kind of began in the year 1979. Like, even before that, there were trends of the rise of pan-Islamist groups in West Asia and in Indian subcontinent. Okay, so just have a look at some of them. So in Egypt, there was this organization called Muslim Brotherhood, which Hassan Banna, Syed Qutb, these were the people who were associated with that organization. And they were talking about something very new, a Sharia-based government, and this whole idea of political Islam. So this was like mingling the modern concept of democracy with the religious injunctions, what your scriptures propound, and creating a theocratic state, which has all the outer trappings of a modern state, but internally and essentially it's a theocratic state. Okay. Then in the Indian subcontinent, at the same time, there were massive communal divisions and communal frictions going on, and an organization called Jamaat-e-Islami was making a very strong headway. Deobandi groups were also making a very strong headway. Maulana Maududi had emerged as a strong figure, propounding the idea of political Islam and Sharia-based society. Later, we all know that, I mean, it followed finally the... Hello? Yeah. Yes. Later, as we all know, that partition of India took place, and Pakistan...
So we are not getting the voice.
Is it okay?
Sir, your voice is not audible.
Yes.
Hello?
Yes, sir. It's
So
fine.
it is audible.
You have been muted in the video.
Should I repeat something?
No,
Yes.
sir.
Yes, sir.
I mean, so when actually it stopped? Can you tell me, like, how many minutes back?
No, just a few seconds before.
Just a few seconds.
So you were
Okay, no
talking about
worries.
the partition, one point, the
Yes,
partition of India.
Okay, then nothing. Then you skipped nothing. So partition of India took place, and at the same time, some disputes remained, like the dispute of Kashmir, and because Kashmir was a very interesting case, as it was a Muslim-dominant society, majority of the population was Islamic, but still the elected leader or the popular leader of the state, Mr. Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah, and also the dictator, the king of Kashmir, Mr. Maharaja Hari Singh, both of them refused to join Jinnah's Pakistan, formed on the basis of religion. They chose India, which was a secular state over Jinnah's Pakistan. Okay, so that remained a major state of dispute between the two countries. I'll definitely come to that part later. And in the West Asia, so in the Indian subcontinent, Jammu Kashmir remained like I would say, some kind of an overhanging dispute. Likewise, in the West Asia, another area which was going to become a major dispute was this Palestine-Israel dispute. And the time period is same. You can see that. 1948, the state of Israel was formed, and Palestine. This issue came up. This Israel-Palestine dispute. Then later, all the Arab states were supporting Palestine. So this is just to give a brief historical background. But then, yes, we moved towards the later part. In the West Asia, Saudi state was formed on the basis of this Wahhabi Islamic ideology. So prior to the Saudi state in West Asia, Turkey was Turkey's Ottoman Empire. They was controlling it was the custodian of Muslim holy places like Mecca and Medina. So they were the real rulers. But then they were clashing with the Saudi people. In Saudi region, there was this tribe called Saud tribe, and there was a religious scholar called Ibn Wahab. He was a great Muslim scholar. So there was an alliance between Wahab and the Saud tribe, the leader of the Saud tribe, that we will fight against the Turkish Ottoman ruler, and we will bring the real puritanical form of Islam here. And Mr. Wahab, the cleric, you will support me as a king. I will support your religious activities, which way we both support each other and make each other strong. Then later on, the colonial powers intervened in this, because colonial powers, they wanted to liquidate the Ottoman Empire of Turkey, and they wanted to weaken the Turkish king. So they supported the Saud tribe and the Saud dynasty. And finally, after the First World War, when Turkey lost the war, the Ottoman Caliphate was dismembered. And finally, the leadership of the Muslim world came to the Saudi dynasty. And the pact I already mentioned between the Wahhabi clerics and the Saudi. So all this was going in a very, very smooth manner. But in the year 1979, something happened which kind of shook the world. So even before that, there was a feeling among the Wahhabi clergy that Saudi kings were just getting astrayed, and they were not doing enough for the restoration of the fundamentalist Islam. So they seized the Mosque of Makkah, a rebel segment, I must say, someone like who were more extremist and all. And at the same time, in the same year, 1979, in Iran, there was an Islamic revolution, and a completely Islamic government came in Iran. The rule of Shah was finished. Shah was sent out of the country, and Islamic government came in Iran. Okay? And at the same time, Russians intervened in Afghanistan. 1978-79. So these three events became landmark events in the history of terrorism. Once the Russians intervened in Afghanistan, Americans also got involved, because they were already fighting a cold war with the Russians, and they wanted to oust Russians from Afghanistan, lest they would make Afghanistan some kind of a major sphere of influence headed by Moscow. So they started intervening. They took the help of Pakistan, and Pakistan's dreaded intelligence service, ISI, assured that yes, we will do whatever you want for you. You support us with all the money, men, and material. So Americans supported Mujahideens in Afghanistan. Mujahideens were trained by the ISI's senior leadership in the army, and they launched a religious jihad against Afghanistan. So that was the time when this whole Afghanistan region saw the rise of various kind of terrorist groups, and they were mostly Deobandi terrorist groups. Okay? Taliban also emerged in the same period. Taliban is another Deobandi terrorist groups. Then your other groups like Huji, Harkatul Mujahideen, HUM, okay, Harkatul Jihadul Islami Huji, Harkatul Ansar, Jaish-e-Mohammed, all these were different, assortments of terror groups which were emerging in that area during this period. Okay. So this area essentially became the hub of the various terrorist groups and organizations. Okay. Now, why I'm mentioning this? Because this will have an impact on Kashmir in the future. We'll come back to that later. And in Iran, when this Islamic government came on the pattern of Islamic revolution, so that actually created a model that yes, I mean, Islamic State can be established. That it is possible to establish an Islamic State by force. Iran was a Shia state, but then yes, it set a model, they set an example that yes, it is possible to completely dismantle the modern state structure and bring back an Islamic State. So that inspired many Sunni extremist organizations across the world, be it Philippines, be it West Asia, be it Afghanistan, be it Jammu and Kashmir, various parts of the world, be it North Africa. It was a source of inspiration. Then in Saudi Arabia, after the siege of Mecca, this mosque of Mecca in 1979, there was an agreement between the ruling dynasty and the Wahhabi clerics, in which the ruling dynasty promised that we will support you massively with loads and loads of money in your proselytization activities in the foreign countries. Like, we give you all the money, you just go and spread Islam across the world. Now they got all the money, the oil money, petrodollars from the Saudi royal family. Money was flowing in massively because of the petroleum wealth. And then the Wahhabis spread throughout the world. And the Islam which Wahhabis brought with them, it was a very different kind of Islam. It was puritanical, it was fundamentalist, it was extremist, and it was rigid. It didn't know how to coexist with the people of other faiths. For example, in India, you have a dominant stand of Islam called Barelvis. They believe in Sufi practices. But when Wahhabis come here, they bitterly oppose Sufi practices. They say that Sufi practices, they are heretics, they are apostates, and they deserve to be killed. So these were the differences. Wahhabis were majorly against the Shia community. They were against the Ahmadiyya community. They were against the non-conforming Sunnis. I mean, the Sunnis, those Sunnis who didn't believe in their version of Islam. They were against the non-Muslim minorities. And with this, this spread of Wahhabi clerics and Wahhabi ideology across the world also spread the extremist strain in the Islam present in the various parts of the world. Because prior to this, the Islam present in the Eastern Europe or in North Africa was relatively a liberal phenomenon. So these three events gave a massive boost to radicalization and extremist ideology. And then later what happened, I mean, we all know, finally the Russians were defeated, Americans withdrew, and then Afghanistan was left in the hands of warlords believing in the extreme religious ideologies of Islam. Taliban came out, emerged victorious. Taliban established an Islamic Sharia-based rule in Afghanistan. Likewise, other groups also came up in that zone where there was a bad governance problem, there was lawlessness, and the other groups were like Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was one of the transnational terrorist groups. Now, here it's important because Taliban was so far, it was a terrorist group, but it was confined more or less to Afghanistan. It didn't want to go beyond Afghanistan. But Al-Qaeda was one of the, I would say, the proper transnational terrorist group, which had the ultimate aim of establishing the caliphate or the Islamic system of society. And it was bitterly against the Western world, the Americans especially. So they were blasting American embassies in Kenya. They were trying to explode the American warships. And finally, they staged the horrendous act of 9/11 terror attack. And finally, after the 9/11 terror attack, the Western world got alarmed with the problem of terrorism. Before that, Western world didn't bother much, Although, as far as India is concerned, it was a major problem for us because one crucial impact of Afghanistan, like when the Americans left and when the Russians left, Pakistan thought that now Americans have gone, they don't need Pakistan, and we are vulnerable because India may attack us anytime. And then they realized that there's this huge army of mujahideens who are rendered jobless after the defeat of Russians. So what to do? They started diverting them to Kashmir, and they started, fomenting this terror trouble in Kashmir. Money was flowing in massively from the Gulf, from Saudi, from various other states, and ISI was minting profits out of it. And at the same time, they were creating Kashmir on the tenterhooks, because they had realized that it is not possible to defeat India in the conventional war. They had lost 3 wars before this: the war of 1971, the war of 1965, and 1947. So they thought that at best they could bleed India through 1,000 cuts only through an unconventional hybrid war, and that is by fomenting terrorism in Kashmir. Different groups came up like Lashkar-e-Taiba, and all these groups which came up, they subscribed to a particular extremist ideology. Like Lashkar-e-Taiba believed in the ideology of Salafism or Wahhabism. You had Jaish-e-Mohammed, which believes in the ideology of Deobandism. Then Hizbul Mujahideen, which was the local terror group of Kashmir, it believed in the ideology of Jamaat-e-Islami, that is Maulana Maududi's political Islam. There are minor differences between the ideological stands of these different groups, but at large, they are against non-Muslim minorities, they are against democracy, they are against multicultural societies, they are against Shias, they are against Sufis, and they are against female empowerment. So I mean, they just want to bring a very racist vision of the social structure. But the Western world didn't pay much attention to India. They said that, well, I mean, it's just that Kashmir is a problem of human rights violation, and India doesn't have a strong case, because Pakistan was a good friend of Americans and they were able to lobby better. Okay? But after the 9/11 attacks, Americans realized that this terror problem has arrived to their mainland. Until then, they were sitting in the comfort zone that this terrorism can never arrive to mainland. So after 9/11, they launched a major global war on terror. They intervened in Afghanistan, and they just, they intervene in Iraq and various other places. Okay. Finally, in 2019, Americans have left Afghanistan. Okay, to 2021. Sorry. Before that, yes, let us also talk about ISIS, which emerged as a major terror group in West Asia. But then here, I want to ask a question. This whole global war on terror over the last 20 years, do you think it was a success or a failure? Anyone wants to answer this question?
According to me, it could be the success for one particular group or failure for other group.
Like which one particular group?
Like we say that initially the great power like USA used those terror group to remove USSR initially. But later on, they faced that same thing during the 9/11. So we, according to me, it was not a proper failure or not a proper success for any particular group, but like sometimes success, sometimes failure.
Okay, well, so let me raise a few very fundamental questions here. Okay. Well, if you want to call it, you said that it was a success in some cases. Okay, well, including the wars on terror financing. Okay, so now for me, if as a security analyst, if I have to define something as a success, I will always have some yardsticks, some indicators for that. And in this particular case, the best indicator would be that, no new terror group arises after this global war on terror. And the terror groups, they have much weaker finances after this, global war on terror. But we all saw that, after the global war on terror, what Americans started, ISIS emerged as the most powerful terrorist group in West Asia, with a much, mightier control over the financial resources, and they were controlling territory. They were having a government in a large tract of that area. They were controlling revenues from oil resources, selling artifacts, or they were indulging in organ trade. And they had much, I would say, powerful organization, much more resources, even a lot more than Al-Qaeda. Likewise, in Kashmir, all the terrorist groups, they continued to flourish like Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, and they acquired new forms in 2008. They were staging stone pelting. They were radicalizing people on a much larger scale. And then finally we saw the phenomenon of Burhan Wani, and finally we saw the phenomenon of suicide bombing in Kashmir during Pulwama, which was hitherto an unseen phenomenon in Kashmir. So personally, I feel that this whole global war on terror wasn't much of a success, but because the Americans, the countries who were leading this war on terror, they were not honest about the intentions. They were just using this as a cover, and they were trying to pursue their own geopolitical motives, or they simply failed to understand the real threat. Like in the case of this war on terror, the Pakistan was the real culprit. Pakistan was funding, feeding, supporting Taliban. Pakistan was supporting the ISKP in the Khorasan province region. Pakistan was supporting all the Kashmir-centered terror groups. And Americans, they just didn't realize it, or they failed to counter Pakistan. They were simply indulging in some field battles against the Taliban guerrilla groups, and they were killing those people. They were attacking them with the drones. Even civilians were getting killed. So ultimately, it generated nothing except the extreme anger and frustration against the American forces. Had they tackled Pakistan long time back, Pakistani intelligence agencies, the terror groups, the leadership sitting in Pakistan, this whole thing would have collapsed long time back. Likewise, in the Middle East, in West Asia, the intervention in Iraq ultimately led to the rise of this ISIS, because ISIS was formed by the soldiers who had earlier been working for Saddam Hussein, and there was no government. There was a complete chaos. So if they had not intervened in Iraq, and finally, I mean, we all know that they were this whole thing of weapons of mass destruction being present in Iraq was a big facade. We could never come out with the solid proof of their existence. If they had not intervened in Iraq, things would have been different in the Middle Eastern world. Finally, the Arab Spring took place, and Arab Spring uprooted all the dictators, but it brought extreme jihadist forces. In Egypt, jihadist forces came to power. In Syria, we see that. Hello. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, sir.
In Syria, we see that all kinds of terror groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, Asrar al-Sham, all these different versions of Al-Qaeda, and they are all existing. And the whole Arab Spring was hijacked by the extremist jihadist groups. So there also the global war on terror failed. Okay? And now we see that I mean, the new actors have come in this global war on terror. That's Turkey trying to support the terrorist groups across the world, and they're supporting them, but just Turkey is supporting them because Turkey wants to get back its old status of the caliphate, the old status which it enjoyed during the Ottoman rule, and they want to completely uproot Saudi from the leadership of the Muslim world. And you have Iran supporting various terrorist groups like Hezbollah in the Middle Eastern world. Okay? Iran also has ties with Taliban. So we don't see any respite. In fact, I would say the global war on terror has been a big failure in terms of effort. And as we saw, when the day Americans moved out, next day Taliban got back to power in Afghanistan. It simply shows that Americans failed to understand the problem, and they simply wasted billions and billions of dollars in Afghanistan and got nothing out of it. Now in the future, this terrorism problem will be much more severe because in Afghanistan, Taliban has come, and it has set an example for the various terrorist groups across the world that, with full faith in your religion and, dedication to fight, you can uproot the superpower also. Previously, terrorist groups defeated superpower called Russia, and now terrorist groups defeated superpower called America. So they realize that, they are emboldened. And once they are firmly placed in Afghanistan, they're going to send terrorists to Kashmir, so which will be a big problem for India also. And then in India, in the present setup, the situation is very polarized on communal lines. Across the country, we see a lot of communal problems and issues. Riots are happening. Okay? Radicalization is increasing. So the terrorism problem will spread to the other parts of India also. In the future, technology will have a great role in supporting and abetting terrorism. Like they are using encrypted communication applications like WhatsApp, Telegram, Signal. In Kashmir, we see that these days they are using drones to drop weapons. In the future, they may use drones to drop terrorists, to infiltrate terrorists. And drones may be used to attack, installations, military installations, corporate setups. So these are the new forms, which terrorists will acquire in the future. They may resort to bio warfare, chemical warfare, all kinds of these unconventional and hybrid threats. We may face to face, may come across in the future. Now, coming to the other aspect of terrorism is the state support to terrorism. The state support to terrorism has always been a critical factor in the entire history of terrorism, and it continues to be so. The two biggest, I would say the villains of the world in the state support to terrorism are Pakistan. First is Pakistan, and second is Turkey. Pakistan played a complete mess in Afghanistan. They have always supported terror groups in Kashmir for the last three decades. They have supported extremist groups, and very finely they have created a system of terror financing in Kashmir and killed thousands of people in Kashmir. In Afghanistan also, they have brought back a terrorist regime to power. But yet, the world community, FATF could not nail Pakistan, could not do much against Pakistan. UN could not do it, simply came out as an ineffective organization. Even the Americans, now knowing it full well that Pakistan is behind Taliban, they are still, they're not doing anything against Pakistan. Next is Turkey. Turkey was supporting ISIS by buying their oil, supporting them with weaponry, supporting them with armaments. So state support to terrorism continues. Okay? And in the future, we see that, China will be, having good deals with the, just a moment. I need to put this on charge. In the future, Chinese will be having better cordial ties with Taliban because they want Taliban to control the Uyghurs, the Uyghur community. Just give me a second. They want Taliban to control the Uyghur community. Uyghur has been creating unrest in the Xinjiang province of China. So China will be supporting Taliban with economic aid and trade and everything. So I see this terror problem rising in the future, and India stands particularly at an enhanced risk because of the internal situation, which is highly tricky and vulnerable because of a communal polarization. And internationally, we are surrounded by states who have been supporting terrorist organization over the last many decades. And we don't have many friends in the geopolitical domain at an international level. Now coming to my next category of threats, that is the category of expansionist states and revisionist states. So in the discourse of international relations, we use terms like expansionist states and revisionist states in a very specific manner. Expansionist states are those who want to expand their territory, and revisionist states are those states who want to alter the maps. I mean, once again, get back old territories, alter the maps, okay, and just be very and act in a very aggressive, violent manner. Generally, states which are rooted, in some kind of ideological, I would say, structure or framework or religious framework, have such illogical and irrational notions. For example, China is a communist state, okay? And China is a revisionist and expansionist state. China believes that, they were for long, in the history, they were the center of the world civilization. They were the Middle Kingdom. But then the Western powers came and Western powers defeated them. Western powers made them the colony. It was a big humiliation and insult for China. So they want to avenge that. They want to take revenge. And they want to expand their territories. They are being aggressive in the South China Sea, where they want to conquer Taiwan, because they believe that Taiwan is the part of China, and Taiwan needs to be forcibly conquered. Okay? Then they're threatening India in Ladakh and Galwan area, in Ladakh region, in Arunachal Pradesh. Once again, they are claiming that yes, this area belongs to us, and they're using 18th century, 17th century maps to prove that these areas are the part of our territory. And they have been indulging in all kinds of cyber operations, psychological operations, military aggression to change the maps. Likewise, they also nurture the similar hatred against Japan, because in the Second World War, Japan was invaded China and committed untold atrocities in China. So they want to, just to level that score also. So this doesn't portend well for the world peace. In the future, it seems highly likely that, if anything happens by chance or, even by design, there is a possibility of a major war, right? A naval war or a land war. You have another revisionist and expansionist state, that is Pakistan. Pakistan believes that now Jammu Kashmir belongs to Pakistan. Now they are saying that Junagadh also belongs to them. So they want to change the boundaries by using military means, by using terrorist forces, by war. They failed in changing the boundaries for the 3 times in history. So that's why they are using terrorist groups now. So these are not rational actors. They will continue to do this in the future also. Likewise, you have Iran in the Middle East, again ruled by a religious regime. They also want to claim the history of the Islamic world. And they want to, they want the end of the state of Israel from that area, and they want to restore entire region to the Palestinians. That's also a revisionist state. You have Turkey, which is a revisionist state. Turkey wants to revive its Ottoman Caliphate. Turkey is supporting terrorist groups in Africa, terrorist groups in Syria, and Islamic extremist groups in India. Turkish President Erdogan was threatening the European nation heads that if you don't let the refugees or settle in your area, we will have them sent to your country, and the bombs will explode on your streets and in your cities. Turkey has made a very strong presence in this form of like spies everywhere in Europe. They are fighting with Greece, they are fighting with Russians, they are fighting with various other powers, with Saudis. They are fighting with France. So that's another expansionist state. Now coming to the non-traditional threats that the world is facing. They also, first of all, when I say traditional threats and non-traditional threats, well, I don't believe in the, I would say, very extreme compartmentalization of these threats. Okay, some of all these things have an impact on each other and they are overlapping. For example, if there is a civil war in a particular area, that always leads to the great humanitarian crisis and food insecurity. And for me, I put food security issue in the category of non-traditional threats. For example, in Afghanistan, you can see, there's an extreme poverty, extreme hunger, especially after the Taliban takeover, and food security will be a major issue. In Africa, all the areas where civil wars are taking place, food security is a major issue. Likewise, climate change is going to be a major problem. We are having high levels of pollution, and then some of these nations who are rising in terms of economic growth, also, they are also trying to claim their share of the growth and also getting indulged massively into the politics surrounding the climate change. And we can see the impact, the glaciers are melting, the season cycle has disturbed. And this climate change problem will impact the food security issues also. The other forms of non-traditional threats will emerge from the cyber world. From the cyber world, now you see, ISIS was doing its entire recruitment and radicalization through online videos. There is no need to go to a particular area. There is no need for a terrorist group to expand in a particular area. Everything happens online. If internet had not been in place, in that case, ISIS would have had to send its commanders and top-level leaders in India for recruitment and for expanding its activities. Now it's very easy. They simply upload a video, how to make a bomb, or a big, arousing, provocative message. Someone from, someone in India watches it, or maybe a few hundred watch it, and out of those few hundred, maybe 4 to 5 get radicalized and indulge in a terror attack. Besides that, internet, I mean, it becomes out as a very potent and a handy tool in spreading misinformation, disinformation. Like Russians used internet and cyber technologies to influence elections in America. They can uproot governments. Likewise, the whole Arab Spring. In this Arab Spring, social media, Twitter, Facebook played a massive role in uprooting governments. In India, it can lead to a big problem. One false rumor of a communal riot on social media, and you can have several killings. You can have a massive communal riot in a particular area. Then you have another threat coming from this cyber world, is from money transaction systems. It's very easy to transact money using online mechanisms, and it comes very handy for the terrorist groups. They use phone SIM cards, phone charging cards for transferring money. Cryptocurrency is a major problem. Cryptocurrency, governments have no control over it. Crypto exchanges exist in the domain where a particular government may not have a control, territorial control or jurisdiction. So you can never trace where the transaction originated. And this tool can be easily used by terrorist groups or rebel groups for transferring money, for disturbing economy, for doing a massive damage and sabotage to a country's economy. Likewise, social media, through its rumors, can also impact the goodwill of the country and dissuade all the investors from investing in a country. I just give one example. Suppose if there's one false rumor on social media that in India, in a particular place, a massive communal riot has taken place and so many people have died. Next day, you will find all the FIIs, the financial institution investors, withdrawing money from the stock market, and your stock market will crash. It will simply discourage the foreign investors in the future from coming to India and invest. So in this globalized world, these double-edged technologies, make, I would say that they present a great threat as well as a boon. In the future, artificial intelligence will, we still don't know how it's going to play out, but then, certainly, in terms of bad effects, adverse effects, okay, it will have much, much larger, ramifications. Okay. So with that, I'll just, rest my case here. And for the youngsters, especially, I feel that, to young students, I suggest that you should all try to develop a strategic sense by reading more and more about the global affairs, and what's happening in some part of the world, connecting with what's happening in this part of the world. And also, just try to look at all these threats from a holistic perspective. Like, a food security is connected with a proper military issues also. So, that kind of cross-disciplinary approach also needs to be developed. And that can develop, it can happen only over a period of time. Once you read, once you learn more, it's like that. Before I end, I'll just like to tell you about what we are going to do in the future. So we have a think tank called Usanas Foundation, and it's based out of Udaipur, Rajasthan, and we mostly work on foreign policy and security issues. In the month of January 2022, we are organizing an international security conference. It's titled as Maharana Pratap Annual Security Dialogue. It's from 10th January to 13th January. It will be online, and this year's theme is terrorism and counterterrorism. And we are getting exceptional speakers from America, Israel, Australia, India, Egypt, and other countries also. Okay. It also includes several people who have worked in the government as ambassadors, as intelligence officials, several senior security personnel. So they will be sharing their thoughts and insights on the critical aspects of terrorism, like terror financing, radicalization, use of cryptocurrency, and encrypted communication applications in terrorism, and the future of terrorism after the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So these are the diverse issues which they'll be talking about, and we'll be opening the registration link very soon. I'll send the registration link to Mr. Anant, and he can share it with you. I hope that will be very useful for the young generation to understand this entire threat, and also it will be a great networking platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Abhinav, for sharing those insights. We'll open it for Q&A. We have quite a few hands raising. So I suggest
Sure.
Avani Singh, you go first. Ask your question.
Good evening, sir. That was
Yes.
indeed a wonderful session with you. Thank you so much for sharing such a great bunch of information with us. Sir, I have certain questions. Like you
Yeah.
said, colonization in India is coming up as a great threat towards our security. So, sir, don't you
But
think so that this would,
colonization? I mean, so I didn't say colonization.
sir, formation of a terrorist group inside our country? That's what I
Yes,
mean
yes.
by.
Oh, radicalization. Yes. No? Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I
Mm.
just overruled the term. So, sir, radicalization is basically leading to a great bunch of problems in our country. So, don't you
Yes.
think so that it would lead a civil war within the country?
Well, you have raised a very valid question, and I already wrote long back in one of my articles for Haaretz that this may turn into a civil war, and we should not really discount that possibility. It can actually, and I mean, although it sounds a little scary, but then there is a sufficient ground, and you have things very ripe for this all leading into a civil war like situation. So mentally we should all be prepared. And unfortunately, our agencies, and our security setup is not very well equipped to handle such situations. I mean, the political leadership in India doesn't have that kind of a vision.
Hmm. Yeah. And sir, one more thing. Sir,
Yeah.
we typically know that China region of Tibet is
Mm-hmm.
actually a captivated region, and
Mm-hmm.
people over there, like the Tibetans and the Dalai Lamas, are seeking help from India, like in residing over there in Dalai Lama areas and all in the
Mm-hmm.
Upper Ladakh. So, sir, what is this? What is the stand of India over there? So that's my question.
Well, see, there are certain portions which China is claiming as its territory, okay, which is simply the part of China's, five-finger policy that was started by Mao, and they wanted Ladakh, Nepal, Arunachal Pradesh, and I mean, all these areas as a part of China. But India is not going to tolerate it. I mean, I mean, we cannot give away the land which belongs to us. Legally, technically speaking, I mean, we have our control, and India will be putting up a bitter fight, and as we saw in Galwan, India gave a very befitting reply, and many Chinese soldiers died. In the future, if there is any Chinese aggression, India is fully equipped to handle Chinese forces and Pakistani forces at a time for the twin front warfare. So they are going to have a tough time. I mean, if they mess up with us, if they mess around in Ladakh, it will be very difficult for them to handle.
Yeah, yeah. Sir, I'm asking about the Tibetan region. Can't
Yeah.
we help those people over there? Because in Ladakh recently the elections over and their missionaries and all, and they created again
So,
a
well,
Tibetan.
in the Tibetan region, let me be very clear. Okay, India is not going to just go out of its way and help people in the Tibetan region, because that's not feasible. Geopolitically speaking, see, China is way too powerful economically, and secondly, I mean, the problem is that I mean, there's no reason for India just to indulge in that kind of adventurism.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Sir. So talking about China, China is also prepared for the water wars. That is going to be the future
Yes.
of war. So,
Yes.
according to its policy of recent time, it has created a recent thing that there would be dams over there on the river of ours, that is
Mhm.
Brahmaputra River.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
sir, what is
Mhm.
the stand of India over there? Because that can be a great threat to us because it created many dams over there on the river, which goes from China to Vietnam. And when it wants, it opens the barricades. When it wants, it closes the barricades. So it is very hard to
Well, China
stabilize.
has a very monopolistic mindset, and and until recently, I mean, we never wanted to fight with China. I mean, we were always looking for economic engagement, trade-related engagement, and just keep the boundary issues on the back burner. But it seems that China has become very aggressive and very hardliner, especially after the arrival of Xi. And I see a conflict very likely in the future. If China continues to be aggressive and indulging in all such things, okay, India is not going to sit back. And we'll give a very good, strong reply to them.
So, sir, what is about the water wars? Because water wars can't be fought by a weapon, na?
No water. I mean, see, if there is something which they are doing, okay, and this may lead to escalation. I mean, it's not like, I mean, one can come up with another dam like what we are doing in the Pakistani in Jammu Kashmir region against the Pakistan. Okay, we are also trying to build dams over there. So those things can be done. Otherwise, certainly, India will raise a lot of noise in the global geopolitical forums like United Nations, multilateral forums. Okay, and India will resist. So it won't be that easy. I mean, it's not always about a war, like, I mean, it's like, even if, see, India is not a country which can be taken lightly. Okay. So even if China is doing, and, if we are bitterly opposing that, bitterly resisting that, okay, and, then, I mean, they cannot take it lightly. And who knows, maybe, I mean, if it goes, beyond the limit, okay, I mean, one can always resort to a military solution for that.
Yeah.
I mean, countries have fought over trade wars. Countries have fought over dams in the past also. So this can happen in the future also.
Yes, sir.
The whole
Because
this
I was
opium
reading the
wars.
article that-
The opium wars took place because I guess the Chinese insulted a British trade representative or something like that long
Yes,
back.
sir.
Okay, so
Yes, like
yeah,
that.
tell me.
All right,
So, sir,
next.
I was basically reading an article about that. So, they said that India should build a reservoir over there to protect the country as well as the civilians. So, it would be great. So, that's why I asked this
Oh,
question. Thank you so much for
thank
this
you so
question.
much. Well, I don't in particular specializing in water diplomacy. Okay, my main focus area is definitely terrorism and counterterrorism. But yes, as a, I mean, so especially if I have to comment on this water part or the water war issue, okay, I will simply say that India is not going to sit back.
Yes, sir. Yes. Surely, sir.
But you can read
Thank you so
Brahma
much, sir.
Chelani. Mr. Brahma Chelani has done a lot of work on water wars.
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
All right, Bhagwan Singh, you go next.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good evening, sir. First of
Yes.
all, thank you for your topic on terrorism and that theme. I really like that. My question is about cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
You talked at the end about crypto. We know that crypto is decentralized and
Yes.
no government or any other organization can control over it. And the terrorists can take the advantage of this in order to do their exchange and in order to grow. So, uh, what are the roles of other organization in terms of crypto? Are they do they want to ban crypto in countries, or do they want to create some restrictions over it, or what could be the steps of big countries like India or United States or any other country?
Uh, if you look at the present scenario, you can find that there's this massive resistance from the various nation states against the cryptocurrency. Okay, I mean, you can see it everywhere. Okay, and many countries are trying to ban it because it has a major impact on the sovereignty issues. Because if you have no control, if being a government, if you have no control over the currency transaction and what current denomination, what currency is being used in a territory, then it makes no sense to be in power. That's why we see a very strong, wave of opposition against these whole, this whole cryptocurrency. Many countries are banning. Some countries are trying to regulate it. Some countries are coming out with their own cryptocurrency. But yes, over the long run, I feel that, I mean, it will be difficult to control this whole cryptocurrency phenomenon, and there will have to be some global consensus. As long as internet is progressing and advancing, this is going to go ahead. This will continue. And it will have many advantages also as far as money transactions are concerned. So it won't be possible to completely control it. You can do that for some time in the future, but not in the eternity. So governments will most likely, they will come out with some kind of a global consensus about its use, its regulation, and some kind of a regulatory measure will be put in place. Maybe different banks will come out with their own cryptocurrencies, or the corporate entities across the world will come out with their own cryptocurrencies. And I feel that it's, if this thing is mainstream, and if it is accepted, the chances of its misuse are less.
Oh,
All right.
so sir, if I ask that now people see crypto as a good asset for their investment
Yes.
and all.
Yes.
So
yes.
can we say that if any country bans it, will it affect their economy also?
Yes, I mean, see, So, there are several ways to think about it. Okay, so imagine just, okay, I'll just give you one example. Suppose you have a crypto exchange located in some part in Russia, okay, and they the owner of the crypto exchange, okay, they release a new crypto coin, okay. Just for example, we name that crypto coin as Vivek crypto coin, okay, or something after the Indian Krishna crypto coin, okay, so now and we just that company itself like on its own, it asks some of its people supporter to start buying that crypto coin, okay. Now if it comes to if the Indians see it, okay, well, Krishna crypto coin is getting so much of buyers, okay, now let's start investing money in it, so it was an artificially pulled up that this whole price hike, okay, people start investing in and then ultimately after a few days or maybe a month, okay, people, Indians, Indian citizens, or they end up investing huge money in it. That money goes to the foreign territory, okay, they reap the benefits, then the prices come down. So ultimately it does a major damage to our economy, right? Hello?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I got it.
So so there are various issues, some so now see it's something where you need to play with this whole idea, okay, if a particular intelligence agency, Chinese will be really good at that, okay, if they want to destroy a country's economy, they may release some kind of a cryptocurrency, just draw all the money, okay, make people buy that currency, okay, and make big elites and corporations invest in that money and then bring the prices down. It will be a big damage to a country's economy. That's why it's better to have some kind to mainstream this thing, and it's better to have a Russian exchange controlling cryptocurrency in India. You should have a local exchange controlling or running the cryptocurrencies in India.
Which means we can say that this crypto can also become a weapon for geopolitical profits.
Yes,
and all.
it is certainly it can become, but it's but see why it's attractive, because it gives you massive returns.
Yeah.
See, in the stock market, if you invest, there are always conditions associated, okay, because see, about a company, and that company is ultimately, for example, a very strong company like Reliance, okay, I mean, it may be a very strong company, but still humans are running it, okay, so it may have its own ups and downs, so prices may come down, this, that, or it can go like Yes Bank, it underwent a massive crash, but in the crypto, it is just like, an imaginary thing, okay, see, for example, if I tell you, okay, just says create, some demon or some goddess with, 10 hands, 4 heads, okay. That, it's a mythological, it's an imaginary creature. You don't know, but still, and since it's an imaginary creature, you have a certain degree of satisfaction that you don't have to take it seriously, okay, it's not going to cause any problems, okay. Likewise, similarly, in crypto, okay, that also gives, because they know that crypto is for example Dogecoin, okay, or Bitcoins, okay, they know that, I mean, if I ask you a question that can you tell me when the Bitcoin is going to fall, are there any yardsticks? No yardsticks, okay, there's no company running a Bitcoin, okay, I mean, there's no, I would say, they're not into manufacturing business, so they're not into suppose their profits go down, so nothing like that, okay. It is just a fictional, imaginary, thing on the, on an exchange, which you see on your laptop screens or on your mobile phones. So that also gives a degree of, I would say, I mean, a leverage, a freedom to play with their prices, which makes a jump either very high or a very big jump downwards. So people take risk and people want to invest. It'll be difficult for government to control all these things in the future.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Next is Krishnanshu Panda.
Very good
Hi,
evening.
Krishnan.
Am I audible?
Good evening. Good evening. Yes, you're audible.
So I have 3 questions, and before that, my gratitude for this amazing session. The first question is, now that we know we are a globalized world and globalization has impacted our policy making, is getting isolated from the world a solution, even if a temporary one, to solve the security threat?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say this is the right way of thinking, because you cannot get isolated from the world. I mean, it's technically impossible. It's just
Okay,
that I mean, you are already integrated with the world. Even in the past, there was no complete isolation. So you have to be ready for the fact that that you are pretty much the part of this world, and you have to be connected with it. Okay, but then at the same time, you have to strengthen your internal institutions, your strategic culture, your responsibilities as a citizen, and the quality of your human resources.
Okay.
That's the
My
only
next
solution.
question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question is, how is security policy making different from policy making in other sectors like economic or social sectors?
Well, security, other sectors, the other sectors have a different, total framework. Like, okay, I mean, well, if you are in the economic field, you are dealing with the local things, and you want to, I mean, motivate more and more people to manufacture. But security domain, here you're talking about factors which can put you at risk. So here, your economic, factors like cost benefit analysis won't be as relevant as your other areas. Like, for example, if you're making a policy in a business firm, okay, you will be strictly talking about, I mean, well, how much profit do you get, this, that, okay. Here, if I'm asking you to invest in counterterrorism, you know that there is no immediate, gain or benefit in the immediate term. It's simply in the immediate future, it may be an investment of $1 billion, for something which looks very fictitious, something like radicalization counter. It may or may not yield result, but still you have to do it.
Thank you, sir. That was enlightening. My last question is there any other way other than using brute force or diplomacy to deal with security issues by internal rebellion? Like we saw in Myanmar, the military coup happened and the people revolted, and Myanmar, the military government used brute force. While in Taliban, the Taliban and the last Afghan government had the diplomatic discussions, but it didn't. It couldn't solve the problem. So, is there any other way?
Well, it depends on the nature of the problem, and I feel that war is always the last recourse, or the military solution. I mean, it always has to be the last recourse. You can take preemptive measures through diplomacy. You should always have much, I mean, sound and better intelligence, systems and networks. Okay. For example, I'll just give you one example. Okay. There was this famous Operation Chakravyuh run by India's IB. Okay. And in that Operation Chakravyuh, they prevented about 200 to 300 boys from joining ISIS. So these are preventive measures. You have to have very appropriate, and very well, entrenched intelligence systems, and then you have to reach out to the people who are feeling disgruntled. Okay. Example, if we talk about radicalization, we should be reaching out to the Muslim Islamic scholars, the people who can define Islam in the proper way, and they can say that, well, this terrorism business is nothing to do, I mean, with Islam. This is totally unholy, unethical. So you have to, and then, keep your population engaged through good governance, good jobs. Okay,
Oh, okay, sir. So basically, to summarize, prevention is better than cure.
Yes, certainly. It's always better than cure.
Yes, thank you, sir. My questions are done.
All right, next is Nishan.
Yes, sir. My question is that is the invasion of Taliban in Afghanistan also a global security challenge, and how can that invasion affect other countries?
Thank you, Nishan. It's a very beautiful question and a very serious question. I think I already answered in my presentation. Certainly, the Taliban's conquest or return in Afghanistan is a global security threat, because ultimately this will turn the entire area into the jihadist hub. And it will help the prospering and flourishing of various terrorist groups in that area, which will continue to spread out in Kashmir, spread out in other parts of Pakistan, in Central Asia, in states like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan. So this is, yes, indeed, it's going to be a major security threat. It will aid and strengthen radicalization.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Okay, next is Anika.
Hello.
Hello.
Good
Yes.
evening, sir.
Good evening. Good evening.
We have seen that there are 5 permanent members of UN Security Council who enjoy veto power, And it is witnessed in the past that whenever a probe against a country supporting or sponsoring terrorism is brought to the table, some or the other country with the privilege of veto block that. So how can it be dealt in a global level by the UNSC?
I mean, first of all, why do you want to deal with it? See, the question is that, United Nations is a powerless, it's an ineffective body, okay? And it's majorly controlled by the country, the big five, the groups who are countries who are donating, giving loads and loads of money to it, okay? And even now, China is violating all the UN norms, Russia is violating all the UN norms, okay? Even if, for example, they pass a resolution against Pakistan or, they make hue and cry, which they've been doing over the past, a few decades, but has it impacted the behavior of Pakistan? I don't see any point in this, okay? And as long as these big five powers, they're going to be the permanent members, I mean, India should just forget that, that they're going to let you in that big five club, and India should not even, make a claim for that. India should rather focus on its internal economic development and other issues like security enhancement and working on its, your people, like, your human resources. Just running after a stupid position in the UN, power circle, I mean, it's not going to help you much.
Sir, do we not need an international body which, oversees every terrorist attacks or
well, we all need, see, we all need, but in the international relation, the problem is that, ultimately at the end of everything, this is a world of anarchy. There is no central authority controlling the, the various nation states. So we certainly, I mean, the need for the overarching international body with mandate and power has always been felt. But then, I mean, they were never effective enough. League of Nations failed after First World War, and Second World War happened. Now UN is failing. We can see that, UN is not able to control Turkey. UN is not able to control Pakistan. China is every day violating the UN. This whole corona came, we could not initiate an investigation. Oh, this will always be there. The one who is powerful controls the situation. UN doesn't have its own army.
And isn't Israel also a revisionist state as it aspires to expand and found Greater Israel, performing evictions and so on?
Oh, well, yes, to an extent, I would say that, because, but Israel is also a kind of a religious state, okay, just like, the way Pakistan was born on the basis of religious ideology, Israel was also born on that. But we have to see that, they are the people who were thrown out of that region. Originally, they were the inhabitants of that area, okay, where they are living, okay. So back in history, they were forcibly evicted, brutally thrown out of that area, and they lived as refugees in the various parts of the world for years. And now, because they kept their cultural and religious identity intact, they always kept it very safe in their mind that yes, they have to go back to their homeland one day. They came back to their homeland. I feel that yes, the only solution is a two-state solution possible in that area. Israel should agree to the formation of a separate Palestine as a separate country, and Palestine and the Muslim nations should accept the existence of Israel. And we see that already this is happening, as you can see that many Arab states like Qatar, not Qatar, Saudi, UAE, Dubai, they are cozying up with Israel now. That is the only practical
solution. Okay, sir. And lastly, I feel terrorism is a product of politics and not religion, since beliefs and practices of terrorist groups are way astray from the scriptures. So what's your stance on that?
Well, I will say that it's always a mix. I mean, see, we always, I mean, okay, fine. If see, religion is also a man-made thing. And religion is made by, like, I mean, certainly, I mean, the scriptures are written by the holy masters or prophets, But then, some scriptures have those, I mean, loose, I would say, ends, which are always used by, the religious leaders and clerics, and they're defined in such a distorted manner for pursuing political objectives, that it ultimately becomes, a source of, abetting, fomenting terrorism. So, the best way is not to completely compartmentalize them. Okay, see, if you say that, suppose ISIS claims that they are the best, representatives of Islam. They will quote right from Quran. Okay, they will quote from the text. Yes, that, well, we ask you to do this, and this is the verse in the Quran, okay, which supports this. So now, if you tell them that, well, there is no connection between religion and terrorism, this, that, okay, no one is going to believe that. But the best way to counter is that to get a good Islamic scholar, okay, and then make him counter that. Okay, he will say that, well, whatever you are saying, you're quoting this so and so verse from Quran. Okay, this verse has to be interpreted in a particular context. It has a different meaning. You are giving it a wrong interpretation.
Yes, sir. Religious representatives can be collaborated with.
Yes.
Tackle it.
Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Palak, go ahead and ask your question. Sorry, I was on mute.
Yes, sir. First of all, a very good evening, sir. I have heard your views and opinions regarding the global security, and it helps to create a lot of awareness. So I want to ask that by observing most of the cases, can we say that the religious disputes is one of the reasons that is responsible for the terrorism?
Yes, I mean, religious disputes, see, it's always a mix, there are always things are overlapping, okay, religious always, religion gives you, like, people fight over the control of a religious place, okay, over a control of a religious church, okay, and then in that fight, some people want to make, their career out of that fight. Yes, so some people want to emerge as the leaders of that fight, so they would want to continue that fight. They wouldn't want a solution for that. So yes, certainly religion is one of a crucial factor that gives rise to terrorism. Certainly it radicalizes people, okay, but then yes, it's not the only factor. There's always an interplay of religion with politics and other factors like social, economic factors, etc.
Sir, so how can these disputes regarding the religion can be resolved so that the terrorism would be much lesser?
Well, frankly speaking, I mean, if you asking about the resolving, I mean, I never normally, when I have to ask things, okay, I never raise such questions, because see, if we are really sincere about resolving the disputes, we can always resolve them. But the question is that who wants to resolve these disputes?
Yes, sir.
The better question is that who wants to, because there is this huge industry which thrives on such disputes, okay, and they're very powerful people. So as long, I mean, they have their stakes involved in it, okay, no one wants to resolve them, and it's going to continue.
Yes, sir. Sir, I have another question to ask. Sir, currently I'm studying in the 9th standard. So we are studying about the India and contemporary world. So in this only, we have studied about the French Revolution, and on that we have studied about the Robespierre, and his rule was known as the Reign of Terror. So can we say that if a country is pursuing dictatorship or is dealing with a dictatorship, then that country would definitely have terrorism?
Well, there's a state terror is something different. State terror is like, when you have a dictator running a country, and the dictator has its own goons and they have their own intelligence agencies, something which Iran, was a state like that. Okay, Savak used to run amok in the country. So that's also kind of terror. State terror is there, certainly. In Pakistan, ISI kidnaps journalists and civil rights workers. That is an example of state terror.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
All right, Anandini, you go next.
Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Thanks a lot for the session. I really learned a lot. My question is that different countries have different stance on terrorism and they try to justify their own views on it. So do you think that good terrorism and bad terrorism, which is identified by different countries because of their hidden interests or different interests, that is the reason that we are not able to have a collective voice against terrorism?
Yes, I mean, you're right. I agree with you. This certain, I mean, theoretically speaking, there is no good or bad. Terrorism is terrorism, but yes, countries define it to suit their own geopolitical interest. Yeah.
So how can we deal with it?
You see, it's all the involvement of big state actors. You can deal with it. If you have power, you can deal with it. The best way to, like, for example, Kashmir. Pakistan is doing all the mess in Kashmir. I mean, if India has the will and power, India should just go and fight it out with Kashmir or with Pakistan. That one more terror attack and will just separate Balochistan from you. Something which NSA said long back in his speech. Okay, or you'll have to pay a very heavy price. Okay, that's how you deal with, if you want to deal with it, but then no one wants that.
Sir, I wanted there's a second question I wanted to ask, that you said that we have been fighting a war against terrorism, and different type of measures were also taken, but the history that you gave us, based on that, I think that they have been different superpowers, and they have been basically, they had a fight with each other, or different countries had fight with each other, and based on the results they try to justify it with counter-terrorism attacks. So it's a big problem. So how can we deal with that? Because basically we are trying to justify our own disputes and problems by giving it a name of counter-terrorism operations or something like that.
See, when the state functions, state has to legitimize what it's doing. Okay, so Pakistan, like in Kashmir, it support terrorists. Okay, but Pakistan, when it acts against Balochistan rebels, they call it counter-terror operations. Okay, likewise, when India acts in Kashmir, we call it counter-terror operations. When Saudis act against the rebels in Yemen, they call it counter-terror operations. So just to suit the narrative, because states seek moral legitimacy. They'll continue to do that. Okay, what you can do is that you can always run a counter narrative. Like when Pakistan is calling Balochistan people as terrorists. Okay, you can always say that, well, Pakistan is, I mean, they have no goddamn right to do so because they are supporting terrorist groups in Kashmir. Okay, and Balochistan also, they have unleashed their own terrorist groups to kill people. So the narrative can fight with the counter narrative.
Thank you, sir.
So Anandini wants to become an IFS officer. So
Great.
So her
great.
interest is keen on the foreign.
Good luck. My best
wishes.
My best wishes to her. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Thank
Next
you.
is Raja.
Anandji, can this be the last question? Because I have to go.
Oh, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, I think maybe last. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Sir,
Yeah.
I need to ask about the policy of America's Donald Trump and now the Joe Biden. Is there any difference on Afghanistan crisis? About
America's
the
policy of Joe Biden and
Donald Trump. Why there is a difference?
Well, even Donald Trump, I mean, he wanted to get out of Afghanistan because Americans feel that China is a bigger threat now. So they have to focus more on China now. And Chinese, kept Americans very beautifully involved in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. And Chinese continue to grow. Americans failed to realize that Pakistan is the real enemy. I mean, if they had tackled Pakistan, they wouldn't have had to waste 20 odd years in Afghanistan. So Trump also wanted to come out of it. But yes, I feel that, if Trump had been there, it wouldn't have been a rout. He would have at least done something to check Pakistan. Okay, but yes, I mean, still, I wouldn't say. I mean, that is a very something which can at best be a gesticulation. It's a guess. Okay, Mr. Joe Biden. I mean, it's a very. I mean, they kind of surrendered to Pakistan. So it was an absolute surrender to Pakistan.
Sir, do you think whether it is a personal interest?
No, not personal interest. It's just, I mean, see, sometimes, there are dependencies. The American strategic establishment feel that they cannot manage Afghanistan without Pakistan, and then Pakistan is always able to play American generals in a very nice manner. Politicians also.
Sir, one important question.
Mm-hmm.
Sir.
Yeah.
So when there is Afghanistan crisis, we have seen some leaders, even in our country, they also jumped on this crisis. They give open lectures So do you think this can be an internal challenge to Indian sovereignty?
Well, if they are supporting Taliban, certainly it can be an internal challenge, because if they are supporting Taliban, its extremist ideology, it will motivate people in our country to join such organizations and become more radical and and execute such terror acts in our country. It is going to be a definitely
So
is
how
going
to
to be a
deal with it,
challenge.
sir? How to deal with it?
I mean, see, the best way to deal with it is that to get the Muslim scholars, the great scholars, from various Islamic schools, and let them talk, let them have a discussion, that yes, how to define Islam, just to give true knowledge about the Islam to people, that this is not something, I mean, this is not the true message of Islam. Then only, I mean, this propaganda then can be countered only through a religious scholar. If the government or some IPS officer says that, well, this is wrong, this is that, okay, it won't make much impact, because on the other side, Taliban will say that, well, we are quoting from a scripture, So only the scholars, your elders, can play a critical role in this.
Sir, thing like NCC, can every young Indians should be allowed to join, or whether this should be included as a curriculum, so that
personally, I feel that I mean, in terms of physical health, we are way behind, the West. Okay, our lifestyles have become very bad. We're mostly on social media. You're not exercising. Okay, so we have really screwed up physical systems and all. So yes, I mean, some kind of the thing like NCC has to be there, and we should play more sports. Yeah, our young generation, and NCC can make you bond well with the people. It gives you team spirit, and certainly it has to be taken up in a serious manner.
All right, there's only one last hand, Abhinav. If you take, yes. I think it will be complete. So 1 minute for this.
Sure.
So Srihita Suryadevara, your turn.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for this informative webinar. So I just have one question, that you are telling that technology will be a good chance for terrorists to attack, like they could use it very well. So how could we prevent it?
Well, it's again a big challenge. Okay, so online radicalization, you should have dedicated teams, working in the intelligence agencies who can identify such bots and troll farms and on the internet, the groups which are spreading fake information. They can keep a continuous check, and then I mean, people should also be we should raise awareness among the common people also, that not listen to such things. Besides that, you have to be always a step ahead of such groups in these technological matters, and you have to enhance your surveillance mechanisms, keeping in mind that you don't violate the human rights and all. Okay? And then, I mean, this is how you fight. You have to be a step ahead of them.
Okay, that means like there should be a separate committee who could be checking that all the time.
Yes, separate committee, and then you should have a dedicated team of scientists and technicians who are coming up, who are developing their own applications, and you should be preemptive in your actions. You should lay traps to identify such groups who are spreading fake information, and once they are caught, arrest them or run a counter propaganda, things like that.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much.
I think Abhinav has extended his time a lot, so I think thank you very much, Abhinav. Really appreciate you spending so much time and giving such deep insights about the world around us. It's definitely that awareness is needed to the future generations, the future leaders. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so
Sir,
much.
can I ask a last question? I've been very confused around it, that's why.
Yeah, please go ahead.
One last, please.
Yeah.
So, yes, sir. A militant group by some are referred as freedom fighters, and other people refer those as terrorist groups. So as a third party, how can we distinguish between the two? I mean, how can we see a group as terrorist group or freedom fighters? I mean, how can we distinguish?
Well, it has always been a long-held, issue, okay, and something which has been, discussed and debated over many years, but there is no fixed answer for this, okay. But yes, if you ask me a question, I can tell you something, which I believe in. For example, Balochistan is a state, okay. and Balochistan was annexed by Pakistan. Okay, Balochistan, the people are Muslim. Okay, so ideally speaking, they should have a problem. But then when they are fighting against Pakistan, Pakistanis are killing them, their army is killing them, okay, and they are calling them terrorists. Okay, now they are the real freedom fighters, because they are not fighting for the religious reason. They are fighting because Pakistan is committing atrocities and they want to have a separate country out of it. Okay, likewise, but in Kashmir, on the other hand, the terrorist groups are killing Kashmiri Pandits, they are killing the Bihari laborers, they are killing Sikhs, people on the basis of their religious and linguistic identity, the geographical identity. They want to establish a Sharia state. This is just one example. So I mean, they are terrorists.
Okay, sir. Thank
I mean,
you.
it's a very serious question, and frankly speaking, and a very relevant question, which is still being debated. So I mean, there is no firm answer to this, and I mean, you have to find your own answer for this, okay? And that depends on where you are located. If you are an Indian, if you are a nationalist Indian, you will find a terrorist in Kashmir as a militant in Kashmir as a terrorist, okay? If you are a Kashmiri Muslim, you might want to call them as a freedom fighter. If you are a Pakistani citizen living in Punjab, you'll call Baluchis as terrorists, okay? If you are a Baluchi, then you'll call them as freedom fighters. So it all depends on your other set of identities, your other religious identity, national identity, linguistic identity, and then your ability to think rationally.
I think, yeah, it all drills down in the end to think rationally, right?
Yes.
If we can become global, then we can think rationally. It all, goes to that, introducing the element of a global citizenry in schools and colleges across the world. At least there can be some hope or some sense where, people see the world as a family. Only then I think,
Yes.
rationality can emerge. Otherwise, individual, identifications, attachments will continue to play, geographic, whether it's religious or, sectarian, they will continue to be predominant, I think,
Yes.
in the near future. Hopefully,
Yes.
we'll have that, across
Sure.
in some platforms. But yeah, thank you very much, Abhinav. Once again, really, really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys, and for your time, students. I hope you enjoyed it. And
Thank you so much.
these are tough debates and tough, sessions, but we have to face this. Yeah. Thank
Yes.
you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye bye for now.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Bye. 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 Thank you.
Thank you, sir.